Welcome to Carefree and Conscious, paranormal and profound authors with stunning true stories. If you like this type of content, be sure to subscribe. I'm your host, Susanne Wilson, the Carefree medium and intuition educator. Today on Carefree and Conscious, Courage and Consciousness, the Peaceful Warrior, with Colonel John Alexander, Ph.D. Dr. Alexander is one of the most fascinating and influential persons involved in consciousness studies. He was with Robert Bigelow at the very beginning of the Bigelow history with Skinwalker Ranch. During Dr. Alexander's Ph.D. program, his faculty advisor was none other than Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. He's also been a leading advocate for the development of non-lethal weapons since he created renewed interest in the field starting in the late 1980s. In 2003, he served as a mentor to Afghan Ministry of Defense senior officials through the Office of Military Cooperation in Afghanistan with the coalition forces in Kabul. He has written numerous articles and books. You can find out more at his website, johnbalexander.com. He's traveled to all 8 of the continents on Earth. He is quite the adventurer, having trekked the remote areas of Tibet, and he has been swimming with whales and sharks. Dr. Alexander's friend list is a veritable who's who of ufology, remote viewing, and he knows a lot of shamans, apparently on all 8 continents. He's been a past president of the International Association for Near-Death Studies, and so much more. In this wide-ranging discussion, you are going to be blown away by his insights. And now, Courage and Consciousness, the Peaceful Warrior, with Colonel John B. Alexander, Ph.D. Colonel Dr. John Alexander, welcome to Carefree and Conscious.
Great to be here.
It is truly an honor to have you here. I'm going to try to ask questions that are good, but I'm so excited that I may get a little weird. I yearn so much to talk about consciousness, and it's not like I can go to a Scottsdale cocktail party or something and walk up and have a deep consciousness conversation with people. That's why I have this, and you're my guy. So I hope you can put up with me for a few minutes.
Let's have at it.
All right, here we go. First off, I want to ask you, why did you say to me the other day on the phone, we chatted briefly, that remote viewing is misnamed? What did you mean by that?
As with many things, near-death is another one that's the same way. When you're early on, you're trying to figure out what are you talking about and don't know much about it. Remote viewing, I think we would have used remote sensing because all senses are involved. It gets beyond, just what's perceived visually. Having said that, the spy community, he really does talk about remote sensing now with all of the sensors that are in space, and they do broad spectrum analysis of what we're observing.
Many different things come into remote viewing. I can remember years ago, I was teaching a psychic development workshop, and somebody asked me, can we talk about remote viewing? And I really didn't understand what it was. And since then, I've done some studying and taught myself a little bit online. And it's my understanding that we have the military to thank for remote viewing as we know it, and controlled remote viewing. What is some of your history in the remote viewing? I know you know all of the great developers and teachers.
First of all, you should know that, like all of these phenomena, they have been around for centuries to millennia. So what we're talking about is a kind of a narrow subset of things that were developed, in this case, by the U.S. military. Lots of pros and cons there. From a commercial perspective, it has taken off. What was initially done at SRI with Hal and Russell Targ became a process We did have for a number of years a formal program. It was what's called a program of record, meaning it was very formal, had a funding line and all of that, and was very, it was classified for a long time. You may know I got into a bit of trouble because in 1980, I was at Command General Staff College and not terribly busy, so I wrote an article called The New Mental Battlefield, which ended up getting published, much to the chagrin of the program. At that time, I did not know it existed. And it didn't make a big splash in the military, although interestingly, because I submitted it to the military review, a very staid military publication, frankly, with no hope that it would get published. There were synchronicity sets in. It turns out that the editor had a near-death experience and had out of body and whatnot. So it went from hey, we're going to publish this to the cover article. And again, in the military, it didn't make a big splash until Jack Anderson, who was a well-known syndicated opinion speaker in the Washington Post, picked it up. And then he called it, the voodoo warriors of the Pentagon. So it had, of course, the negative sense. That comes back to also interesting. Well, I'll tell you right now, the guy who really wrote the article said they did it and they wrote it positive, but they said, oh, the public is not going to stand for this. Is going to be a new expose. And so they flipped a few words and switched it from a positive thing to a negative thing. Much to their surprise, they said at that time they got more response to that article than any article they had ever published before, all running against them, or 97%. And it was, look at what the Soviets are doing and all of that. That led to a confrontation inside the Pentagon. At the time, I was working literally in the bowels. I was an inspector general, Army inspector general. And they wrote, a guy came into my office one day and said, did you write this article? I said, yeah. Well, don't you know the process for getting it cleared? Yeah. And I said, well, what office are you from? And it just so happened I had the clearance paper in my desk. I don't know why it was there that day.
Wow.
So here, is this your office? Fast forward a number of years later, I'm now in INSCOM, in the intelligence community, doing various things. A lot of it was in the psychokinesis arena. And this guy raises his hand. He says, would you like to meet the guy who cleared that article?
I love that. So you're writing this, what you think is this interesting topic, this little article, but because the person who decides where it goes in the magazine had just had a near-death experience, you are the cover, you are the thing, you have no permission to be talking about any of this, and it blows up, but it creates this expansion in this room for consciousness to expand. But then don't they have to create sort of like a role for you that maybe wasn't there before?
Well, it was not from that article per se, but again, there's a whole series, and this fits right in with oneness and the synchronicities that are happened. Some of them I've already mentioned, from writing the article to the editor to the guy who approves it accidentally, and that Jack Anderson would pick up on it. What happened was a year or so later, there was a woman who was married to a retired colonel who was running psychic conferences in the Washington area. And I had been there and been one of the speakers, and she knew about, I'm just talking about generic sorts of stuff. So it turns out that her husband, she was the friend of the wife of the Deputy Secretary of Defense, who had an interest at the time. This is name, the General Richard Stilwell. He had retired and was now DepSecDef. So I got called up to have a one-on-one meeting. Now, I was still a lieutenant colonel at the time. Lieutenant colonels do not go in and meet the Secretary of Defense or deputy without some flag officer or general coming along as a head bobber if they don't know what you're talking. Well, that didn't happen. So I had a one-on-one. I went up about 12:30 that day, and we were having an interesting discussion. And then he says, "Well, where do you work?" And I told him I was, Army Inspector General. He said, "Oh, okay." So I left the office probably around 1. I thought, well, that was interesting. Wonder what that meant. Went back down to the bowels. They're on the 5th floor. We're literally on the bottom. And about 4:15, 4:20, the chief of staff of the Inspector General's agency came in and said, "Tomorrow morning, you don't work here anymore." I mean, he had just, hadn't asked or anything, but just moved me in that. That's the rest is sort of history after that.
Wow. Well, you are an adventurous soul, and you're also what I guess people might call a peaceful warrior. When did you become interested in the whole non-lethal and protect life? I mean, this is special forces. They're out there taking care of business. What do you think it is in you?
Well, that actually comes forward a number of years later after I retired. My second career was at Los Alamos National Laboratory. Ronald Handel's the one who brought you the atomic bomb and all that, and it is a nuclear weapons laboratory. But I was working in the intelligence community there and looking at what was ongoing in the area at the time. We had the invasion of Grenada, for instance, in Panama. And I'm looking at that and going like, we just got these overwhelming force. And the problem in Panama, we had a complaint with Noriega and a few of his henchmen, but basically had a long history with the Panamanian people. And that got very contentious, closest to conventional warfare that we've been in a long time. And the question was, from a military perspective, is there a way to project force and to do that without killing a lot of people? And the point there, of course, was you had big families with long memories. And you've probably heard about the cycle of violence and how these things keep recurring. So what I was thinking about was, is there a way that we can do this? Now, law enforcement, of course, had been working on non-lethal things for quite a while. It was particularly since the mid-'80s. By the way, a time frame now it is early 90s. And so it was, how can this be done from a military perspective? And ended up running a number of conferences. We also ran, by the way, from simple sorts of things that you know about, like tasers and pepper ball and that sort of thing. They're kind of small anti-personnel, all the way through to what we call strategic incapacitation, meaning how can you take down a nation state and do that without killing people and watching for secondary and tertiary casualties. For instance, if you go after electrical grids, and you want to bring them down, but for a limited period of time, if you do it with hard bombs, if you're going to recreate this, you've got what we call long lead items. It's going to take months to years to bring the system back online. And you really want to be able to do that in hours to days. So what kinds of systems could you use? And again, this is one of the many possible applications that can be done. Again, to reduce the infrastructure capability, but you want to be able to bring that back up, because if you don't, within a very short period of time, you do have, well, all the things that rely on electricity, from all your food, refrigeration, hospitals, everything else.
So what was it like briefing the White House, briefing the highest levels of government about non-lethal peacekeeping? What were you drawing upon there?
Well, of course, understand you don't start at the etheric levels. You have to
You
move up
you
the food
started
chain.
you started in 1956, it says here on your
Well,
bio. So you have done some moving and
well,
some
I've
learning and
been,
growing.
yeah, no, I joined the Army as a private in 56. So
Hmm.
now I remember I've gone through
Yeah.
all the enlisted grades. I was a E7 sergeant first class when I went to OCS, then moved from there to, full colonel when I retired, the probability of which is, again, approaches zero, but did happen again. Well, from the time I made major, I guess, I was never assigned by the typical system. Everything I was moved from one general to another who were supportive. On the other side, there were some people who were not happy with that too. So it wasn't like everybody's on board and wanting to do this. But and again, looking at the recent history in again, we're talking early 1990s. Military is certainly amenable, or many of them, to what are the options. I might mention, and this gets current, what you hear now constantly is this: we got to focus on lethality, and you certainly want to have that as a capability. But the idea that you can kill your way out of problems, and we particularly saw this in Vietnam or in Iraq, Afghanistan, just saying, no way you're going to be able to do that. And going to Sun Tzu, the intent of the military, contrary to what you're hearing currently, is not about killing people. It's about the ability to impose will. Can you get them to do whatever it is? And if you go back to what I mentioned earlier on people with long cycles, it might, I guess the current situation would be what's going on in Gaza. And, you know, terribly, terribly complex. But it's, this is a generational issue that's going on. By the way, one of the things that I forget which general was, the head in Iraq had a sign that said, have I made more terrorists today than I've killed?
Yeah.
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 So again, it's the big families, long memories, long history. The intent is to be able to apply force, and this is getting a long ways from your overall consciousness questions,
But
obviously, but
no, I think it's important. We think a lot of times about military protecting us, but we need more healers and peacemakers and people who are aware that consciousness is not in the body, that we're all connected, that there's universal consciousness here. And you're developing that all along through this storied military career. And then you start working on your doctorate, and you have the most amazing, I guess, chair of the doctoral program. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
well, that's another synchronicity, if you will. What happened was the person we're talking about is Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who is kind of legendary. People will know her the 5 stages of grief and all that sort of. She was also instrumental in bringing hospice to the United States. She was Swiss. And at the same time, near-death experiences, she and Raymond Moody were contemporaries there. In fact, I had attended a course and heard one of her lectures talking about near-death experience. So we're talking mid-70s now. Ions has not even been formed at that time. So there was I attended a lecture by her, and then there was a workshop that was extremely interesting and very unusual. It was called Life, Death, and Transition. And in it, about half of the people who were there were medical. About a quarter of the people were like me, just kind of generically interested. The other quarter were dying, I mean, terminal patients. So you talk about a heavy emotional content to, what's going on. Fast forward a bit, so I went back. I was assigned in Atlanta, Fort McPherson at the time. And so I sent her a letter that said, gee, thanks, that was really intensive, blah, blah, blah. Fast forward a few weeks later, I get a call out of the blue. Again, I'm at Fort McPherson there. And it was a woman who said, look, I'm Elizabeth's secretary. She's going to be in Atlanta tomorrow. Can you meet her at the airport? Again, we're 70s where you can go to the gate and meet people and things like that. Well, yeah, of course. And I already had my master's degree, and I was getting ready to grind out a dissertation for the doctorate. And so Elizabeth comes in, and we have a couple of hours before she has to catch the next flight. And she said, I know 1,000 people in Atlanta, and I chose you to call, and I have no idea why. I said, man, I think I'm supposed to ask a question. And would you? And she goes, oh, yes. What does that mean? So anyway, those are the sorts of synchronicities you just cannot program.
Yeah, for people who've never been in a doctoral program, I'll tell you right now, I'm a dropout. I did a little over a year, and I was working a full-time job at the time. I had enough experience to learn how to do group research, but to have somebody say that they're going to work with you through your program is a really big deal. And to have it be Elizabeth Kubler-Ross is an even bigger deal. It's a huge commitment for them. I don't feel like there anything. I agree with you on the word synchronicity. And I've seen an interview where you spoke about even as a little boy, you wanted to be involved with space, and we weren't in space for a long, long time. And then you have all these things happen one after another after another. But the common thread, the through line that I see is that you reach out and you grab the opportunities. You don't sit back and think about it and wait. Where do you think this decisiveness comes from in you?
Yeah, well, remember, I use synchronicity in kind of a generic term. There's no such thing as, these things that just happen.
Right.
Don't know, like a audience might know, I actually remember World War II. I was a little kid, but growing up, but actually remember those sorts of things. So when you say space, yeah, of course, all of the things on paperclip and us going into space hadn't even been thought of yet. So it was just about that, but it just was almost a very attractive thing to me, as was adventure. That's why I ended up going into the military. Had come home from college and was working. One of the things that happened, I was supposed to be going back for my sophomore year, and I wasn't terribly interested. Something called Special Forces. We're talking the 50s. You see, Special Forces wasn't even created until 52. And I had read a couple articles and I said, oh, that'd be really neat. So went down, signed up, and surprised my mother when I came one day. Said, by the way, in the morning, I'm leaving. Oh, probably not the best thing, but as I say, the rest is history.
Switching gears a little bit now, what I really wanted to start off with remote viewing, not just because you're an expert and you've seen the evolutionary process of how we approach it, but there are people right now that are remote viewing in different dimensions. And I feel like when I teach intuition development, it's to empower people and to let them know that they don't have to go and get readings and pay someone to tell them how to tune in. They just need to learn how to do it. Do you think that we can remote view other dimensions successfully? And do you think we can remote view Three Eye Atlas, for example? And do you have some thoughts on that thing?
Well, the short answer would be yes.
Okay.
And as you get in now, as you probably know, again, you have a very sophisticated program created by the military at SRI. Ingo Swann is the one who would come up with the concept of the matrix.
Yeah.
And that, by kind of definition, is interdimensional because the ability to move around the matrix. This was long before the movie, by the way, but actually has a lot of similar attributes. Well, early on, I guess one of the questions that came up is how do you do this? And the supposition was some kind of electromagnetic wave, where you don't understand it, but the brain goes out and contacts and gets the information and comes back. And that's well and good until you start perturbating time and you get into precognitive and retrocognitive sorts of things. So you're moving fluidly, throughout time. And one of the things I think we're now discussing again in the consciousness arena is that our entire concept of time and space is not very accurate.
Well, you're always a soul, right? You're always a soul. So when somebody asks you, okay, John, where is consciousness? What do you say?
You're a spiritual being having a human experience, I think is the quote.
And what do you think happens when we leave this body at death?
Whoa. Not sure where to go. Well, first of all, it is my perception. I don't like to get into people's religious beliefs because that's whatever it is. But
Fair enough.
I think the evidence that says that consciousness continues is beyond all reasonable doubt that we have done. Now, one of the issues that comes up is it consciousness that continues or is it personality that continues? And mediums know you go out there and the data that's coming back is related to a personality. I think the more we get into it, it's far more complex than that, and gets in understanding where it's going. My thoughts on that have changed over time. Not even quite sure where I am now, other than understanding that there is a continuation of consciousness. And again, near-death experience certainly indicates a lot of the contravening facts are that, why is it that people have such different experiences in there? And that it's not all the light, the tunnel, autoscopic, i.e. out of body, etc., that there are significant differences in there, and trying to understand all of those. But having said that, I know you've had our friend Eben Alexander, no relationship, of course, and his case, one of the things I would disagree with a bit with what he said was he says his is not significant, that there are millions, and there certainly are millions. The significance is that he was a neurosurgeon and really understands neurophysiology and how the brain works and that. And I think that sets him aside from many of the others. There are now some more neurosurgeons. It was interesting because I joined IONS right after 1980. I was still in Washington at the time. IONS had just been formed. And
were you the first president or one of the early presidents?
No, I was one of the early presidents.
Okay.
Ken Ring and Bruce Grayson had preceded me. I think I was right after Bruce. I was on the board for a while before becoming the president of IONS. The cases there, we were dealing with sort of anomalies. It was strange, it's very rare. And then the more you studied, you find, no, this is much more frequent than people. And the problem at the time was that, you're talking about this, frankly, at your own risk. And particularly if you're a patient, because people, if you tell your doctor, you know, I can fix that, you know, have a shot, it'll go away. And in fact, one of the, and now something called Survival Net, there's about 100 of us who are in near-death researchers and involved. And there's a very recent paper came out headed by Bruce Grayson, I think, and the issue is how do you inform and educate doctors so that when they hear these cases, they don't treat it as a psychological problem that can be fixed chemically or otherwise, but we need to make it go away. And from what we've heard from a lot of people who have had experience, and I think you may be one of these where you know, told people and say, no, it can't, must be a hallucination, oxygen deprivation, or any chemicals or something else, all of which can be eliminated. But to understand that, you know, this probably really did happen, was something that was real, and not to treat it, you know, as a psychopathology.
For me, it made me rethink my priorities and also realize that I wasn't living a very good life. I was materialistic, not in the terms of a materialist scientist, but in the terms of getting ahead in work and business and all of that, and pretty much ashamed of having all the intuitive abilities. That was a secret thing for weekends. And after that, a lot of things happened, a lot of changes occurred, but people have to process those kinds of experiences. I call them experiences of light. And another interesting thing you've said of many is that all of the phenomena that we're looking at are contact with other dimensions, with those who are not now in bodies, but used to be the discarnate, the near-death experience, the out-of-body experience, all of it is one big experience of consciousness. You know what? I just listened last night to Chris Bledsoe's, I finished his book last night, and he said something about how you had a couple of experiences of incontrovertible proof of contact, either extraterrestrial or interdimensional.
You should know that I wrote one of the forewords for his book.
Yeah.
And yeah, no, that was, by the way, subset. I also, again, back in the Pentagon days, did run a ad hoc research group studying UFOs. We call this Advanced Theoretical Physics Group. So this is an area I've had interest that usually get asked this question. This literally goes back to 1947. I was 10 years old and whatnot. But no, what happened is that I had a friend, I had met Chris at a friend's house, Larry Fasella, and we had talked, and I had interviewed him literally for hours on tape. And then got arranged to go to his house. He was living in Hope Mills, North Carolina at the time. And his case is terribly complex. I mean, every phenomenon you can imagine is involved in it. So what happened, we had spent several days with him. We went down to the Cape Fear River where his initial event had occurred. And it was getting quite late, early evening, light was, and we walked back a couple hundred meters to where the car was sitting. And Victoria, my wife, and Emily, his daughter, were in the back seat, and Chris and I were leaning against the left front fender, and he's pointing. He said, well, this is where this has happened. This is where that happened. And all of a sudden he stopped and said, oh, I think they're here. And all of a sudden this pops into view and goes zipping off, and I saw that. And that's when he went, whoa. And again, it's the temporal relationship between him saying that and this event occurring. It was the second time I've ever seen anything. The first one was much more minor than that, and not nearly as dramatic. And of course, with Chris, as you brought it out, He does this on a daily basis.
Yeah.
And goes out to these conferences and people see them and he films it. And I thought one of the most interesting revelations on that, we did a program called, there was one episode of Beyond Skinwalker Ranch. And it was with Chris and I was out and had filmed with it. But then the guy who was kind of orchestrating things arranged to get a EEG helmet. So they were able to do it. And it was interesting with 3 split screens. On one screen, there's Chris pointing and saying, there's a UFO. One screen shows the orb floating around there. And the third screen is his EEG. And you see this profound shift that takes place at that time. So there's no doubt that there was something, and again, to see all of those things together was quite remarkable.
And speaking of Skinwalker Ranch, it seems like some of the best evidence that we have of interdimensional contact or beings who are non-human intelligence comes from that ranch. And you were part of that with Robert Bigelow for a long, long time. How did you approach those studies? I mean, that thing is massive. There's so much going on.
Yeah.
Wasn't it overwhelming at first? Or, I mean, what was the process, the thought process?
Well, first of all, I was with Bob the day he bought the ranch.
Yeah.
People now know that Terry Sherman had the ranch. We heard about it. And by the way, we believe Terry. He is straight arrow, as was his family.
Cool.
He hasn't come forward very much, but he had a number of very significant events. So Bob and his legal assistant went back to the hotel, and I spent the night up on the northern ridge line that you've seen on the mesa that is now, quite famous. Frankly, while I was there, nothing happened. The most anomalous thing with a lot of mosquito bites right after, sun went down and that sort of thing. But having said that, now there were the NIDS days. I've now retired from Los Alamos as well, which is a campus of the University of California. And that's a whole number of synchronous events, how he came to meet me, and then he was going to, he wanted to create what became the National Institute for Discovery Science. I was living in Santa Fe, working up at the lab at Los Alamos. He'd come in to visit, and there's something called the Santa Fe Institute, which is predominantly in chaos theory. Thought he wanted to buy it, but Murray Gell-Mann was their Nobel laureate and kind of too big egos, not going to work. So created the institute here in Las Vegas, where I'm at now. And then he heard the stories about Terry, and then they made a deal. That was kind of maybe a learning lesson. People that isn't this wonderful. And that wasn't all wonderful, and particularly for them, because the family took a lot of heat in the community. By the way, this applies to Bledsoe as well.
Oh, yeah.
What happened to him and his family, this was not appreciated. Certainly, they were coming from a fundamental religious family. These things aren't supposed to happen. Even MUFON screwed him over.
Oh, God,
happened.
That is a terrible entry in history that I think people hopefully have healed from now.
But of course, the point here is all these people will say, isn't this wonderful? There's some downside. Joe McMoneagle, for instance, remote viewer 001, a good friend and all that. And can't use all the vernacular here, but it was. It wasn't wonderful doing this remote viewing. We're talking now in the 70s or the 80s. He says, no, it was like having a knife fight in a phone booth every day. So, yes, now looking back, these things look, interesting and all of that. There's a lot of trial and tribulations that go along with many of these things as well. As we've now talked that's a remote viewing type of incident, Chris Bledsoe and the ranch. While these things are becoming more acceptable, at the time, it can be, quite a bit of consternation. And again, we were doing it was with ions when it was first formed. We were still trying to figure out what is this and what we're doing. We had a differentiation between those of us who were researchers, that includes Ken and Bruce and Raymond Moody and the people who were experiencers who said, I don't want to be a white rat. I have a strong emotional issue that I need to deal with. That you want to research it is, just different. So it took a long time. I've just recently been at the 50th anniversary of Life After Life that Raymond Moody wrote. And the difference now, well, I'll give you a key one, is that, as you know, we've had a number of mediums and they're kind of the rock stars. There's several of them, and they are the big hits. In early 1980s, would not have touched it. Mediums after death came. No, none of that. None of that stuff. What we're going to deal with now. As you know, with the folks you've researched with, like Gary Schwartz, this has become kind of the center of this.
Right. But I think that the near-death community, though, is just barely dipping a toe into what I call interdimensional allies or off-world beings or maybe ultra-terrestrial, depending on the vernacular you're using. They're starting to dip a toe into that. Or do I have that right?
I think it's more than a toe. And I just had a long conversation because I had talked about giving a presentation and said, I'm just not going to do that. What I wanted to talk to was the board member, and I've just had a conversation with the incoming president who will take over from Jan Holden. And it was kind of like past, present, future, where we were. And by the way, when I was the president, we were in survival mode, literally, from an economic perspective. And the idea that now you have 1,000 people attend these sorts of things. And you do have, well, one of the main ones are the number of doctors who come in, like Eben, where he comes in as a materialist and has his reality flipped upside down. So you've got a number of those cases. Pam Reynolds' case you're probably familiar with. That was a key one because most near-death experiences happen extraneously, remotely, something happened. But that was the case where they have somebody who's fully instrumented at the time. So the question is always, well, were they really dead or not? And they go, in her case, people not familiar with it. This is one where has an aneurysm deep in the brain,
right,
and operating, and they drained the blood out of her body. And the point was that they have cessation of breathing, cessation of heartbeat, and cessation of cortical electricity of the brain. That's known as death.
Yeah, and that speaks to Bruce Grayson's scale or continuum of what is a near-death experience. I remember when I had the anaphylaxis, I thought, I don't know what to call this. I don't know really what this is because I wasn't in the OR on a table hooked up to monitors. And so now we know what this is. I mean, if you have an out-of-body experience and your heart stops, you've had a near-death experience. There's just all these different kinds. And then you talk about shared death experiences. And there's so many types of
Well,
things now that come
that
under that
that
umbrella.
was another leap
Yeah,
when they came along with a shared death experience.
yeah,
And for the people who don't know, that's when you've got an individual who's close to death and often transitions over, but the people around have observations, physical observations that talk to what happened. And you see things like physical changes in the room and awareness. One of the things that is becoming quite discussed now is something called terminal lucidity.
right.
Or people who, have been mentally out of it or in a deep coma for a long period of time, and then shortly before they transition, wake up and are having these very lucid conversations, often with discarnate entities that other people don't see. Some people who have the ability to see that do acknowledge that it's, and confirm that these conversations are taking place. And it's not a hallucination.
Have you changed over time in terms of what types of data points or how many data points you need to evaluate some phenomena?
Not that I need to do it, but certainly that the number of data points have expanded exponentially. Again, things like the number of doctors who have had personal experiences, the number, one I know Evan mentioned with Mary Neal, and I think that's one that's just a phenomenal case. This is one where she's kayaking, goes over, gets stuck underwater for 30 minutes or more. And I notice, but people talk about that as, physically, she did not hold her breath. But there are physical miracles that appear with that case. She's in a remote area of northern Chile. You get her out and take her to the waiting ambulance in an area that does not have ambulances, let alone that they'd be waiting on a remote area. During her NDE, she receives information about events that are going to happen in the future that do, in fact, come to pass. The most classic one is she's told that when her son she had 4 small children, something no mother wants to hear is, by the way, your son's going to die. And at time and get that. And she's had for a long period of time never discussed it. It wasn't until he was 17 that she even told her husband about that premonition that turned out to be accurate. So there you have distortion of time. Now, by the way, you're also getting into the whole question of free will and predestination. And like I say, these get terribly complicated. Is there something you could have done to have intervened so that event didn't happen? And of course, what you're mentioning also, I think, talking about, the predestination, what did we actually plan these things? And if so, in what way?
Okay, well, this is very non-scientific, but if you had to, let's say, assign a percentage of how much of life is planned in advance and how much is free will, what would you guess? Just guess.
I don't even know how to talk about that, because what it appears is that you have a series of significant events
Yeah.
that are there that you're going to be faced with, but you still have the choice. And that's where the free will comes in. You have choices to go down road A or road B. But you get in the percentage of that. Where I agree, this was again with Evan, as he talked about, because his was so, a comprehensive NDE and talking about levels of reality and how things emerge. It
Well,
is
let me tell you something.
incomprehensible, literally. And one of the
Yes.
problems that we have in all of these is it is ineffable. meaning it cannot be explained, and I think is beyond our ability to understand or even contemplate.
Well, my answer some days is 100% of this is free will. You come here with some overarching themes, life learning lessons. But if you get at those and how you get at those are a function of free will. And then a few weeks later, you can ask me and I'll go, I have no idea. That's something we're gonna have to ask when we get to the other side. But the point is, we're not here to be in control of things. I feel like we're here to identify our unique gifts and leverage those to make life better for ourselves and for others, to forgive and love with our whole hearts and receive forgiveness and love. And we get challenged along the way.
A few years ago, I came up with something I call Alexander's Law of Appropriate Complexity.
Ooh.
And what I meant by that is each person comes in and you have these degrees of complexity. And just about the time you think, okay, I got the sucker figured out, it opens up and there's a whole new level of complexity. And
Okay.
but that would fit
Yeah.
with what we're discussing here. As you said, I want X number of critical events. And then you choose, and depending on the choices that you make, do you make positive ones or negative ones? And this is where the idea, I think, the critical issue is the illusion of separation.
That's
That
it.
you are separate.
I have a list of strange phenomena, strange lights, crop circles, electrical and technological anomalies, cattle mutilation, strange creatures, unusual animal behavior of regular animals, moving objects, unexplained things found at the ranch. Like there was a 1964 nickel that was found way down in a drilling hole. When you look at analyzing all of this information, are you trying to explain how it arises, where it comes from, or are you looking for the meaning of the phenomena?
That's a tough question. I think being a human experience and coming from a scientific background, that I tend to look for, okay, what are the rational explanations and how that, from what we've discussed here, you understand the spiritual nature that says this is bigger. And some of them you just don't have rational explanations as we have thought of it as such. As you know, I'm currently in the midst of an issue, personal thing that's ongoing that, really don't understand that. Specifically as the death of an adopted son that appeared quite very recently and very unexpectedly. And
You're okay to talk about that, or how much do you want to say?
well, no, hey, this happened literally a month ago. I got a call from where you are, the Maricopa County
Right.
medical examiner saying, call, that can't be good.
Right.
And it's not quite sure how they can say a lot of internal processing that has to go on with that.
If
His
you're,
mother had died, so I'm literally the only relative living at the moment. So
and how old is he?
it would have been 40 the following week.
Right. It's very unexpected.
Like I say, this is one where we're still processing the possibilities. So
Yeah.
I don't think it's sorted out yet.
What do you think is the most important the most important message we should be honing in on right now in the United States in terms of the changes that are happening? And there's so many things, and I'm not trying to lead you to politics, because that's really not a topic that we have here, but I want to, I think I want to ask in terms of divisions, regardless of who's right or who's wrong or what's helpful, hopeful, and healing and what's destructive. What do you think we're supposed to take away from the experience we're living through now?
I am not sure. I don't know if I should say this. I had met with Eben a couple of months ago. I was at an event in Charlottesville, and he came in and talked specifically about this because there was a number of people, some of whom you know, that I've been discussing these with, and his take was kind of like, got to go through this, and it's preventing us from doing something worse. And I'm not sure what worse would look like. As we've mentioned, I'm very concerned about the state of democracy itself.
Yes.
And the question that comes up is, can democracy survive? By the way, I've been writing about this for years. And, one of my articles a couple of years ago was, are we going to vote ourselves out of existence?
Yeah.
And think may have done that. I'm also, one of the things contemplating is capitalism compatible with democracy, and particularly American capitalism that seems to be very predatory in nature. And it's like these other areas, it gets terribly, terribly complex. And then if you look at, we right now have this discussions against, no oligarchs and all that. Transition that back to what did you achieve, agree to achieve during life? That they came in obviously with some set of predispositions that would take them into a position to do that. You have the ability. Then, if you look at, by the way, an early book that I wrote, I'm looking at Ted Turner when the creator of CNN, and taking at that time $1 billion. This was decades ago. What the point was, as an individual, he was doing certain things as an American that was impacting foreign policy and making huge changes that would take place there. If you look at the current ones, been very concerned about Doge, for instance, the number of deaths that are going to be directly attributable to the cuts that have taken place. And this gets back to the concept of oneness, if you will, because most Americans go, Africa, who worries about that? And I literally wrote the book on Africa, the monograph, when I was a senior fellow with JSOM. And Americans have no idea, about the country of Africa. No, it's a huge continent, and issues that are coming up there. The current things that are taking place with China, I think takes a lot of issue. But again, if you move this to a spiritual realm, Chinese and Africans are also spiritual beings. And out of all these pieces fit together into some greater whole, and tough to think about.
It is. And I know we're being very diplomatic here and trying to look at this through the spiritual application. I will tell you one thing that frustrates me is colleagues of mine saying, just hold the space in your heart and meditate and pray and rise above everything. It doesn't matter what's going on in the world, you're whole. And I'm like, well, yeah, but we're here to be part of a community. Yeah. So if you're in favor of things that are happening, your actions go that way. If you're opposed to things that are happening, your actions go in opposition. We don't just sit and let things happen. We're co-creators. So I've been frankly heartbroken at seeing people just say, "Oh, rise above, rise above, rise above." And I wonder when we all get to the other side, back home where we're from, if we're going to sit down and Monday morning quarterback this thing and go, man, I missed a great opportunity to be of service, to see where I'm needed, to use my influence. I put my personal sovereignty on hold just to wait and see what would happen. Regardless of what you believe, it just seems to me paralysis is not what we're here for.
Well, it's free will, isn't it?
Yes, yes, free will. I'm big
And
on free
what
will.
did you choose? I think that's going to be, one of the big
Yes,
questions. You talk about life reviews that take place with NDEs and that,
yes.
and whether or not it's pejorative, but the ideal is, okay, you're going to have to evaluate, what did you choose?
What did you choose? And also the actions that you take here on Earth now, what is your motivation? Motivation is so key to who you are as a soul, as a being. You did something nice, but what was the motive for what you did? You did something evil. Was it something that you plotted, or was it in the moment of you were defending yourself? Or, I mean, there's choices in every hour and every moment, and that's why I have this fascination with what the military does, because there's deadly force, there's lethal force, and there's non-lethal force. I believe there's no accident that you started your career in the military and then you've developed, you've had all these layers of experience. You've been on every continent. I understand you've even swam with sharks. Is that correct?
Great white sharks, and the most interesting, I think, was humpback whales in the open off of Tonga.
Okay. And when did shamans come into the picture here?
Oh, a long time ago. We've been with shamans from, from the Amazon to the Himalayas, to interesting cases in Mongolia, to various stands. And yeah, my wife's a devotee of ayahuasca, so I've been in many of those ceremonies. And yeah, I've met shamans all over the world.
I could talk to you all day, but I think I have taken way too much of your time already, and I'm very appreciative of that. Gosh, oh, my question list is so long. I ask this often of my guests. How would you like to be remembered here on Earth?
Like to be and will be, I think, are probably two different issues. Um, yeah, ask me that. I'm not quite sure how to address it. What you would like them to know is, again, you're a spiritual being having a human experience. And also, I guess, quote with Einstein, and that is that this is an illusion, or life is an illusion, but a very persistent one.
Yeah, life is an illusion, but a very persistent one. And is there anything else that you like people that are listening to this or maybe watching on YouTube to take away that maybe something that would help them um, move forward in their lives or have more confidence that they are always connected with a greater force?
Well, A, that's true. B, one of the things that sort of got denigrated, got set aside here, was the idea of meditation and contemplation on these issues. Um, yeah, there's a
Yeah,
evil cannot be overcome in this lifetime, but it can be resisted.
right. So the meditation and
Quite
prayer is
Chang can't.
important. It's not the only thing we do.
Yeah.
It's like the vision board. Do you remember when making vision boards and cutting things out and pasting them? And that was a big thing. Maybe not in your world, but around me, it was definitely a big thing. But then people would open a drawer and shove them in. And I'm like, okay, but what actions did you take to move forward? But at the end of the day, we can only work on ourselves first, right?
Well, that I think is the message that you decided, no, didn't, you chose to come in this incarnation. By the way, one of the things in NDEs that IONS was first formed was, would you talk about reincarnation? The nighttime talking, they would never say that formally, but everybody says, yeah, that just does make a lot of sense. But of course, now we're looking at the complexity of what that means. Again, the personality versus consciousness moving on, and what does that mean? And is there a big, the Akashic records or a big database in the sky that you plug into and become in and out part of, or how does that all address? Again, my law of appropriate complexity, that you come here to solve the issues that your soul pattern needs at this time.
Wow, that's wonderful. Thank you for that. Dr. John Alexander, thank you.
Thank you.
Visit our website, carefreemedium.com, or find us on social media @carefreemedium. Thanks for supporting Carefree and Conscious.